The jungle was never silent on Guadalcanal. Even in the moments before dawn, on September 13th, 1942, when exhaustion should have brought stillness, the darkness hummed with insects, the distant calls of unseen birds, and the labored breathing of wounded men. Major Yukichi Kokusho of the Imperial Japanese Army's Kawaguchi Brigade crouched in a hastily dug position south of what the Americans called Edson's Ridge, staring at the dark mass of terrain that had consumed nearly 1,200 of his comrades in just 2 nights of fighting. The ridge itself was unremarkable, a low spine of coral and volcanic soil rising perhaps 100 feet above the surrounding jungle. But it had become something else entirely, a killing ground that had shattered every assumption Kokusho and his fellow officers had held about the American fighting spirit. Kokusho had been trained at the Imperial Japanese Army Academy, where instructors spoke with certainty about the inevitable collapse of Western forces when confronted with Japanese Bushido, the warrior spirit. Americans, they said, were soft, addicted to comfort, lacking the discipline for sustained infantry combat. The evidence seemed clear. The rapid Japanese conquests across the Pacific in the previous 9 months, the surrender of European colonial forces, the chaos of the early American defense. Yet on this ridge, defended by fewer than 900 U.S. Marines, that certainty had died as thoroughly as the men who had charged those positions. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The path to this devastating revelation had begun months earlier, in the strategic calculations made thousands of miles away in Tokyo. When American forces landed on Guadalcanal on August 7, 1942, the response from Imperial General Headquarters had been swift but fatally underestimated. The island, with its partially completed airfield, was important but not important enough, they initially believed, to require the full weight of Japanese military power. The first counterattack had been thrown back, the second had been repulsed. Now, the Kawaguchi Brigade, some 6,000 men under Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi, had been tasked with dislodging what intelligence estimated as a poorly supplied, demoralized American garrison. Kokusho remembered the briefing aboard the transport ship. General Kawaguchi had been confident, his voice carrying the certainty of a man who had spent years in China watching enemy forces crumble. "The Americans have landed with minimal supplies," he told his assembled officers. "Their logistics are stretched. They are isolated on a hostile island, far from their bases. We will strike them at night, when their technological advantages are neutralized, and they will break as all Western forces break when faced with determined Japanese infantry." The plan had seemed sound. The Kawaguchi Brigade would land at multiple points around the American perimeter, then converge on Henderson Field, the airstrip that had become the focal point of the entire Guadalcanal campaign. The main thrust would come from the south, through the jungle, striking at what intelligence suggested was a lightly defended sector. The attack would be coordinated with naval bombardment and airstrikes, overwhelming the Americans before they could organize effective resistance. Japanese night fighting tactics, refined through years of combat in China, would negate American firepower advantages. The Marines, accustomed to peacetime comfort, would abandon their positions when faced with the terror of close combat in darkness. The first night's attack on September 12th had seemed to confirm some of these assumptions, but only at first. As Kokusho's battalion moved through the jungle in darkness, the silence had been almost total. The approach had been textbook, columns moving quietly through the dense vegetation, maintaining formation despite the difficult terrain. Then, around 10 o'clock at night, the ridge erupted with fire. What shocked Kokusho wasn't the presence of defenders they had expected resistance, but the nature of that resistance. The Americans didn't fire wildly into the darkness, wasting ammunition in panic. Instead, their fire was controlled, disciplined, coordinated. Flares burst overhead with regularity, turning night into harsh shadowland where advancing Japanese infantry became exposed targets. Machine gun positions had been carefully sited to create interlocking fields of fire. Artillery, more artillery than intelligence had suggested the Marines possessed, began falling with devastating accuracy, directed by forward observers who seemed impossibly calm, given the chaos of night combat. Kokusho had watched his lead companies shred as they approached the ridge's southern slope. The Marines were using a defensive technique that seemed counterintuitive. Rather than holding a single fortified line, they had created a defense in depth, with positions that could fall back and regroup while supporting elements maintained fire. When Japanese infantry overran one position, they found themselves exposed to fire from positions they hadn't known existed. The Americans communicated effectively in the darkness, radios and field telephones that allowed rapid coordination. Most disturbing of all, they didn't break. Even when Japanese infantry closed to grenade-throwing range, even when the fighting became the intimate violence of bayonets and rifle butts, the Marines held or withdrew in good order to prepare fallback positions. The night had cost Kawaguchi's brigade hundreds of men for minimal gains. A few forward American positions had been taken, but the main defensive line centered on that low ridge remained intact. As dawn broke on September 13th, Kokusho had gotten his first good look at the American positions in daylight. What he saw made his stomach tight with a realization he couldn't yet fully articulate. The defensive positions weren't crude foxholes dug in panic. They were carefully constructed, sited with clear understanding of fields of fire and mutual support. The Marines had barbed wire not much, but placed intelligently at choke points. They had ammunition, they had food, they had water. Most tellingly, they had artillery support that suggested far more guns than intelligence had reported. Throughout that day, as both sides probed and prepared for the night's renewal of combat, Kokusho watched American aircraft fighters and dive bombers operating from Henderson Field. The airstrip the Marines were defending wasn't just a military asset, it was operational, and they were using it. The implications were profound. The Americans weren't desperately clinging to a tenuous position, hoping for relief. They were conducting an offensive campaign, and Guadalcanal was a base, not a beachhead. The supply situation that intelligence had described as critical appeared instead to be functional. The Marines were eating. They were armed. They were supported. Whatever logistical problems they faced, and Kokusho had no doubt they faced many, they were not the starving, ammunition-depleted force that briefings had described. That second night, the night that was now ending as Kokusho crouched in his position, had been worse. General Kawaguchi, perhaps recognizing the previous night's failure, had committed more forces to the assault. The plan called for simultaneous attacks from multiple directions, overwhelming the American defenses through sheer weight of numbers and aggressive night tactics. Kokusho's battalion had been assigned to support the main assault, pressing the southern approaches, while other units struck from the east and west. The attack had begun shortly after 9 o'clock in the evening. This time, the Marines seemed prepared for the tactics. Their artillery fire was immediate and heavy, falling on approach routes that suggested forward observers had marked probable avenues of attack during daylight. The machine gun fire was even more devastating than the previous night, the tracers creating deadly patterns in the darkness. And the Marines were using something Kokusho hadn't fully grasped the previous night, pre-registered artillery concentrations. American artillery doctrine, Kokusho was realizing, was fundamentally different from Japanese practice. The Japanese army emphasized direct-fire weapons and close combat, with artillery playing a supporting role. The Americans had inverted this relationship. Their artillery was the primary killing tool, and the infantry's job was to direct it and hold positions from which it could be most effectively employed. As Japanese infantry concentrated on assaults, American forward observers called down fire with devastating precision. When Japanese troops reached the American lines, they found Marines who fought with the confidence of men who knew massive firepower stood ready to support them. Kokusho had personally led an assault element toward what maps designated as Hill 123, a knob on the southern end of the ridge complex. His company had advanced through artillery fire that killed men with methodical efficiency, then hit American positions defended by Marines who refused every tactical convention Kokusho had been taught. They didn't panic. They didn't surrender. Even when overrun, small groups of Marines would fall back to new positions and continue fighting. The Americans used their terrain intelligently, creating killing zones where Japanese infantry were channeled into narrow approaches dominated by machine gun fire. At one point, perhaps 2 hours after midnight, Kokusho's unit had actually reached the crest of the ridge in one sector. For a brief moment, it seemed the line might break, that the American position might finally collapse as Tokyo had predicted it would. Then the Marines counterattacked. Not a wild charge, but a coordinated movement supported by automatic weapons fire and, incredibly, artillery fire called down within meters of their own positions. The Japanese foothold disintegrated, and Kokusho found himself retreating through the jungle with perhaps half his company. As dawn approached on September 14th, the scale of the disaster became clear. The Kawaguchi Brigade had committed approximately 3,000 troops to 2 nights of frontal assaults against a position defended by fewer than 900 Marines. The result wasn't a narrow American victory, it was a catastrophic Japanese defeat. Bodies of Japanese soldiers littered the approaches to the ridge, testimony to attacks that had achieved almost nothing. Estimates would eventually put Japanese casualties at over 1,200 killed or wounded. American losses, while significant for such a small force, were a fraction of that, perhaps 100 killed and wounded combined. But the numbers, devastating as they weren't the full story. What Kokusho was confronting as he sat in his position that morning was the collapse of a worldview. Every assumption about American military capability had proven false. The Marines weren't poorly supplied, they had enough ammunition to sustain 2 full nights of intensive combat. They weren't poorly led, their commanders had positioned forces intelligently and responded to Japanese tactics with flexibility and competence. They weren't lacking in fighting spirit, they had held positions that Japanese infantry, considered among the best in the world, had been unable to take despite enormous sacrifice. Most fundamentally, the Americans had demonstrated something the Japanese military establishment had convinced itself didn't exist: the ability to outfight Japanese infantry in sustained close combat, while simultaneously bringing to bear the industrial and technological advantages that Japan's resources could never match. The Marines on that ridge had combined individual courage and tactical skill with systematic logistics and overwhelming firepower. It was a combination that Japanese training and doctrine had no answer for. Kokusho pulled out a small notebook, one of the few personal items he still carried. In it, he had kept occasional observations throughout the Guadalcanal campaign. The entries from weeks earlier were filled with confidence, predictions of inevitable victory. Now, in the growing light of September 14th, he wrote a different kind of entry. We were told the Americans lacked spirit for infantry combat. We were told their supplies were inadequate, their positions weak. Every part of this intelligence was wrong. The force that held this ridge was not inferior to us. They were superior not in courage, perhaps, but in every material and tactical factor that decides modern battle. We attacked them with more than 3-to-1 advantage in numbers, at night when their equipment advantages should have been neutralized, and they destroyed us. He paused, considering whether to include the next thought, then wrote it anyway. If this is the quality of American forces we can expect, even on distant islands with stretched supply lines, then what hope do we have when fighting closer to their main bases, with even greater material superiority? What happens when we face not 800 Marines but 8,000? Or 80,000? The question hung in his mind as the morning brightened. Around him, the survivors of the Kawaguchi Brigade were beginning the grim process of withdrawal. There would be no third night attack. The offensive had failed completely, and Henderson Field remained firmly in American hands. The strategic implications were enormous. The airfield would continue to threaten Japanese supply lines, making reinforcement and resupply of Japanese forces on Bimen, Guadalcanal, increasingly difficult. But for Kokusho, the strategic situation was less immediately pressing than the psychological revelation. The battle for Edson's Ridge represented something more than a tactical defeat. It was proof that the fundamental assumptions underlying Japanese strategy in the Pacific were flawed. The Americans weren't going to collapse when faced with determined Japanese attacks. They weren't going to abandon their positions when supplies grew scarce or casualties mounted. They were going to fight with competence and tenacity, backed by industrial resources that Japan simply couldn't match. Years later, historians would identify the Battle of Edson's Ridge as a turning point in the Guadalcanal campaign and, by extension, in the Pacific War. The Japanese would continue to fight for control of the island for months, but the failure to take Henderson Field in September of 1942 meant that American control of the air and sea around Guadalcanal would grow progressively stronger. The supply situation that had seemed so favorable to Japanese strategy, isolated Americans far from their bases, would reverse, with Japanese forces finding themselves cut off and starving, while American supplies flowed with increasing reliability. But at that moment, as Kokusho gathered his remaining men for withdrawal, the historical perspective was unavailable. What he knew was immediate and personal. He had watched 1,200 men die, attacking a position that intelligence had assured them would fall easily. He had seen American Marines fight with skill and determination that matched or exceeded that of Japanese infantry, while possessing material advantages in artillery, communications, and logistics that Japanese forces simply couldn't match. The lesson was clear, though whether it would be acknowledged by higher command was uncertain. The Americans they faced in the Pacific weren't the demoralized colonial forces that had surrendered in Dezos, Southeast Asia. They weren't European troops fighting far from home with questionable commitment. They were professional soldiers, well-trained and well-supplied, fighting for objectives they understood with support from an industrial base that was just beginning to mobilize its full potential. As the Kawaguchi Brigade began its retreat into the jungle, abandoning the approaches to Edson's Ridge that had become a graveyard, Kokusho took one last look at the American positions. Through field glasses, he could see Marines moving among their defensive positions, consolidating control, tending to their wounded, improving their fortifications. They looked tired but organized, capable of sustained operations. Behind them, Henderson Field was already active, aircraft taking off for patrols and strikes against Japanese positions elsewhere on the island. The ridge had held. The Americans had won. And in that victory, they had demonstrated a fundamental truth that would shape the rest of the Pacific War. Japanese forces might have superior tactical aggression, might possess the warrior spirit that training emphasized, but the Americans had something more decisive. They had the ability to combine tactical competence with overwhelming material superiority, and they had the will to sustain combat operations regardless of casualties or hardship. For Major Yukichi Kokusho, educated in a military tradition that emphasized spirit over material, the lesson was bitter but undeniable. The war that Japan had started with such confidence, premised on assumptions about American weakness and Japanese superiority, was going to be far more difficult than anyone in Tokyo had imagined. The 800 Marines on Edson's Ridge had proven that much, at a cost of 1,200 Japanese lives. The withdrawal from Edson's Ridge was not the chaotic rout that characterized some military defeats, but it was no less devastating for its orderliness. As the Kawaguchi Brigade pulled back through the jungle on September 14th and 15th, the physical toll became apparent. Medical personnel struggled to treat hundreds of wounded with supplies that had never been adequate for sustained combat. Food stocks, already low after the difficult approach march through Guadalcanal's interior, were now critically depleted. The jungle that had seemed like an advantage, allowing Japanese forces to approach undetected, now became a prison, its dense vegetation making evacuation of wounded men a torturous process. Kokusho watched as stretcher-bearers carried men who would likely die before reaching anything resembling a field hospital. Others, too badly wounded to move quickly, were left with what medical supplies could be spared and the grim understanding that they probably wouldn't be evacuated. This was the reality of Japanese logistics on Guadalcanal. There was no robust supply system, no chain of well-stocked medical stations, no fleet of ambulances or hospital ships standing by. Everything the brigade needed had to be carried on men's backs through terrain that made pack animals useless. The contrast with what he had observed of American logistics was stark. Even from a distance, even through the chaos of combat, Kokusho had noticed things. The Marines had radios that allowed them to call for artillery support within minutes. They had ammunition stockpiled in prepared positions, suggesting supply lines that functioned reliably. Their wounded were evacuated. He had seen stretcher-bearers moving during lulls in the fighting, carrying men toward the rear, where, presumably, medical facilities existed. The Americans were fighting an industrial war, where logistics and material determined outcomes as much as courage or tactical skill. This realization forced Kokusho to reconsider everything he thought he understood about the Pacific War. Japanese military doctrine, developed over decades and refined in China, emphasized offensive spirit and light infantry tactics. The philosophy was elegant. Highly trained, motivated infantry could achieve objectives through aggressive action, night attacks, and willingness to accept casualties that would break less determined forces. Logistics were secondary. Japanese soldiers were expected to live on minimal supplies, to capture enemy stores when possible, to endure hardships that Western soldiers supposedly could not. The problem, now devastatingly obvious, was that this doctrine assumed the enemy would break. It assumed that aggressive tactics would achieve quick victories before logistics became critical. It assumed that Western forces, facing determined Japanese attacks, would abandon positions and equipment, but the Marines on Edson's Ridge had broken all those assumptions. They hadn't abandoned their positions. They had endured Japanese attacks that should have overwhelmed them, and they had done it while maintaining supply lines that kept them fed, armed, and supported by artillery. The strategic situation on Guadalcanal crystallized the larger problem. Japanese planners had assumed that taking the island would be relatively straightforward land forces, overwhelm the American garrison, and secure Henderson Field. But that plan depended on rapid victory. The longer the campaign extended, the more it became a logistics contest, and logistics was precisely where American advantages were most pronounced. The U.S. Navy, despite losses at the Battle of Savo Island and other engagements, was managing to supply Henderson Field. American aircraft operating from that field were interdicting Japanese supply attempts. The famous Tokyo Express fast destroyer runs that brought supplies and reinforcements under cover of darkness was proving inadequate for sustained operations. Kokusho had heard rumors from other officers, whispered conversations about the broader situation. Japanese forces on Guadalcanal were slowly starving. Disease, particularly malaria and dysentery, was claiming more men than combat. Ammunition was rationed, food more so. Meanwhile, intelligence suggested that American forces were growing stronger, receiving reinforcements, and building up supplies. The window for Japanese victory was closing, and the failure at Edson's Ridge had accelerated that closure. As the brigade made its painful way through the jungle, Kokusho had time to reflect on the specific tactical lessons. The Marines' defensive doctrine was sophisticated in ways he hadn't fully appreciated during the battle itself. They had established a main line of resistance, but with sufficient depth that penetrating the first positions didn't mean breaking through. Forward positions could be traded for time and enemy casualties. Fallback positions were prepared in advance, with fields of fire already cleared and range markers established for artillery support. The American use of artillery was particularly impressive. Japanese doctrine used artillery primarily for direct support of infantry attacks. The Americans had inverted this. Infantry held positions from which artillery could be most effectively employed, and the artillery itself did much of the killing. During both night attacks, Kokusho had watched as American artillery fire fell with devastating precision on Japanese assembly areas, approach routes, and concentrations. The Marines had forward observers who could call fire missions quickly, and the artillery units themselves could respond within minutes. The coordination suggested extensive training and, more fundamentally, enough ammunition to allow that training and to sustain fire missions throughout long engagements. Machine gun employment was equally sophisticated. Rather than placing machine guns in isolated positions where they could be identified and suppressed, the Marines had created interlocking fields of fire. One gun might cover another's flanks, while a third covered both. When Japanese infantry assaulted one position, they found themselves exposed to fire from weapons they hadn't identified. The guns themselves were well supplied with ammunition. There was never the slackening of fire that would suggest exhausted supplies or desperate rationing. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Even the American use of illumination parachute flares and handheld flares showed systematic thinking. The Marines hadn't fired flares randomly, hoping to catch Japanese troops in the open. Instead, they used illumination to cover specific approach routes and likely assembly areas. When a flare burst overhead, American machine gunners and riflemen already knew where to look, already had their weapons oriented toward the most dangerous areas. The result was that Japanese infantry, trained for night combat where darkness would protect them, found themselves fighting in harsh, flickering light that favored the defenders. All of this pointed to something Kokusho found difficult to fully articulate, but impossible to ignore. The Americans approached war differently. Japanese military culture emphasized the spiritual, the warrior's fighting spirit, the willingness to die for the emperor, the power of aggressive action to overcome material disadvantages. American military culture, as demonstrated on Edson's Ridge, emphasized systematic, thorough planning, robust logistics, combined arms coordination, and the application of overwhelming firepower to achieve objectives with minimum friendly casualties. Neither approach was inherently superior in some abstract sense. But in the context of industrial warfare in the 20th century, the American approach had decisive advantages. Wars were won by the side that could sustain operations longest, that could replace casualties and equipment, that could maintain supply lines across vast distances. Japan's resources were finite, stretched across an enormous empire gained in months of rapid conquest. American resources, while not unlimited, were vast enough that the losses at Pearl Harbor, devastating as they seemed, had not crippled the U.S. Pacific Fleet. Already, new ships were entering service. New aircraft, newer and better than those that had fought in the war's early months, were reaching operational units. The Kawaguchi Brigade reached a temporary position several miles south of Edson's Ridge on September 16th. Here, in relative safety from American patrols, officers could take stock of the disaster. General Kawaguchi himself was shaken, his confidence visibly eroded. The general had built his reputation on aggressive infantry tactics, and those tactics had achieved nothing against the Marines. In subsequent days, Kawaguchi would be relieved of command, his failure at Edson's Ridge marking the end of his combat career. But the relief of one general didn't address the fundamental problems the battle had revealed. Kokusho attended a staff meeting where surviving officers discussed what had gone wrong. The conversation was revealing in its contradictions. Some officers argued that the attacks had simply been poorly coordinated, that with better timing and more aggressive leadership, the ridge could have been taken. Others suggested that American casualties had actually been higher than they appeared, that one more attack would have broken the defense. A few, like Kokusho, argued that the entire premise had been flawed, that intelligence had grossly underestimated American capabilities, and that Japanese tactics were unsuited to the kind of defensive positions the Marines had prepared. The debate was ultimately pointless. Whatever the specific tactical failures, the strategic reality was unchanged. Henderson Field remained in American hands, and Japanese forces on Guadalcanal were in an increasingly precarious position. The failure to take the ridge meant the airfield would continue operating, which meant American air superiority over the island would solidify, which meant Japanese supply efforts would become even more difficult. In the weeks following the battle, the situation on Guadalcanal deteriorated for Japanese forces exactly as the logic predicted. American reinforcements arrived, bringing the 1st Marine Division up to full strength and then beyond. More aircraft flew from Henderson Field, making daylight supply runs by Japanese ships impossible. The Tokyo Express continued its night runs, but destroyers could carry only limited cargo, nothing like what was needed to sustain major operations. Japanese troops began starving in earnest. Disease, always present in the jungle, became epidemic as malnutrition weakened immune systems. Kokusho, by late September, was dealing with a company that had effectively ceased to exist as a combat unit. Of the 150 men he had led to Guadalcanal, fewer than 60 remained fit for duty. The rest were dead, wounded, or, incapacitated by disease. Food rations had been cut to the point where men were eating grass and tree bark to supplement the handful of rice they received each day. Ammunition was so scarce that units were ordered to conserve it for defensive purposes only. The offensive capability that had characterized Japanese forces in the campaign's early days had evaporated. By early October, Imperial General Headquarters recognized that the Guadalcanal campaign required major reinforcements. The decision was made to commit the 2nd Division, a crack unit that had distinguished itself in previous campaigns. The plan called for a major offensive in October, coordinated with naval operations, to finally dislodge the Americans from Henderson Field. Kokusho, hearing of these plans, felt no confidence. The 2nd Division might be better supplied initially, but they would face the same American capabilities that had destroyed the Kawaguchi Brigade. Unless something fundamental changed, unless Japanese forces developed answers to American firepower and logistics, more troops would simply mean more casualties. The October offensive, when it came, confirmed Kokusho's pessimism. Japanese forces attacked with greater numbers and better preparation, but the results were depressingly similar. American defenses held, Japanese casualties mounted. The pattern established at Edson's Ridge repeated itself. Aggressive Japanese attacks ran into systematic American defense in depth, backed by artillery and air support that Japanese forces couldn't match. By late October, the offensive had failed, and Japanese forces were withdrawing once again. Kokusho survived the October fighting, though by this point survival was as much about avoiding disease and starvation as avoiding American bullets. He had lost perhaps 30 pounds from his already lean frame. Malaria had left him weak and feverish. His uniform, never replaced, hung in tatters. The proud officer who had landed on Guadalcanal in August had become a scarecrow figure, leading men who were themselves on the edge of starvation. In November, the decision was made at the highest levels to continue reinforcing Guadalcanal. More divisions were committed, more supplies attempted. But the fundamental problems remained unsolved. American air and naval power interdicted supply lines. Henderson Field continued operating. Marine and Army forces on the island grew stronger, while Japanese forces grew weaker. The mathematical logic was inexorable. Japan was losing the logistics war, and in modern warfare, logistics ultimately determined outcomes. By December 1942, Kokusho had been evacuated from Guadalcanal, his malaria severe enough that even in the desperate manpower situation, he was pulled out. He spent several weeks in a hospital in Rabaul, slowly recovering physical health, but never quite recovering his certainty about Japanese victory. The war that had seemed so clear in December of 1941, a war Japan would win through superior fighting spirit and tactical aggression, now looked very different. The Americans had proven they could match Japanese tactical skill, while bringing to bear material advantages that grew larger over time. The battle for Guadalcanal would continue until early February of 1943, when Japanese forces finally evacuated the island. The campaign had cost Japan dearly, approximately 25,000 dead, most from disease and starvation rather than combat. Ships lost trying to supply the island, aircraft destroyed in aerial combat or on the ground. Perhaps most significantly, the campaign had shattered the aura of Japanese invincibility that had characterized the war's first year. For Kokusho, the Battle of Edson's Ridge remained the defining moment, the point where belief collided with reality and reality won decisively. He had gone into that battle confident in Japanese superiority, trusting in doctrine and training that emphasized offensive spirit above all else. He had emerged understanding that spirit, while important, was insufficient against an enemy that combined tactical competence with overwhelming material advantages. The 840 Marines who defended Edson's Ridge against 3,000 attacking Japanese troops represented something more than local tactical proficiency. They represented a different way of war, systematic, industrial, devastating in its efficiency. The 1,214 Japanese casualties suffered in 2 nights of fighting were testimony to what happened when aggressive tactics met prepared defenses, backed by superior firepower and logistics. In the years that followed, as the Pacific War ground toward its inevitable conclusion, the lessons of Edson's Ridge would be repeated at ever larger scales. Japanese forces would continue to fight with courage and determination. But courage alone couldn't overcome the industrial might that America brought to bear. Islands that should have been impregnable fortresses, Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, fell to American forces that combined aggressive tactics with firepower that Japanese defenders simply couldn't match. Kokusho survived the war, one of the relatively few Japanese officers who served on Guadalcanal, and lived to see 1945. In post-war interviews, he spoke about Edson's Ridge with a kind of reluctant respect. The Marines who held that position, he said, had fought as well as any soldiers he had encountered. But more than their individual courage, what had impressed him was the system that supported them, the logistics that kept them supplied, the artillery that supported them, the air power that covered them, the medical care that evacuated their wounded. We were taught that spirit could overcome material disadvantages, he said in one interview conducted in the 1960s. At Edson's Ridge, we learned the limits of that belief. The Americans had spirit, that much was clear, but they also had artillery and aircraft and supplies and medical care and all the advantages that industrial power provides. We attacked with superior numbers, at night when we thought our tactics would be most effective, and they destroyed us. That was when I began to understand that Japan could not win this war. The Battle of Edson's Ridge lasted 2 nights, in September of 1942. The strategic impact of those 2 nights rippled outward for months, helping to determine the outcome of the Guadalcanal campaign and, by extension, influencing the entire course of the Pacific War. But for the men who fought there, both the Marines who defended and the Japanese soldiers who attacked, the battle's significance was more immediate and personal. For the Marines, Edson's Ridge became one of the defining moments of the Pacific War, proof that American forces could stand against Japanese attacks and prevail. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson, who commanded the defense, received the Medal of Honor for his leadership. The ridge itself was renamed in his honor, a permanent marker of what had been achieved there. For Japanese officers like Major Yukichi Kokusho, Edson's Ridge represented something darker, the moment when certainty died and doubt took its place. They had been taught that Japanese forces were inherently superior, that Western soldiers would break under pressure, that offensive spirit could overcome material disadvantages. The ridge, with its rows of Japanese dead and its unbroken marine defense, had proven all of those beliefs false. The numbers told part of the story. 840 Marines had held against 3,000 attacking Japanese troops, inflicting 1,214 casualties, while suffering approximately 143 killed and wounded themselves. Those numbers represented nearly a 10-to-1 casualty ratio in favor of the defenders, a devastating indictment of the Japanese tactics, and a powerful demonstration of what prepared defenses supported by artillery could achieve. But numbers alone didn't capture the full significance. Edson's Ridge was important not just because of the casualties inflicted or the ground held, but because of what it revealed about the nature of the Pacific War. This was not going to be a conflict decided by warrior spirit or tactical aggression alone. It was going to be an industrial war, decided by logistics, firepower, and the ability to sustain operations across vast distances. In that kind of war, American advantages were decisive. The Japanese military establishment never fully internalized these lessons. Throughout the remainder of the war, Japanese forces continued to emphasize offensive tactics and fighting spirit, continued to launch attacks that resulted in catastrophic casualties, and continued to believe that determination could overcome material disadvantages. From the Philippines to Iwo Jima to Okinawa, Japanese troops fought with suicidal courage and achieved tactical surprises, but they could never overcome the fundamental disparity in resources and industrial capacity. For Kokusho, writing in his journal weeks after the battle, the conclusion was inescapable. We went to Edson's Ridge, believing we would sweep away the Americans in a single night. Instead, the ridge swept us away. We lost more than 1,000 men. We lost more than a battle. We lost the certainty that had carried us through the war's first year. The Americans showed us that they could fight as well as we could, and they had advantages in material that we could never match. From that night forward, victory seemed not inevitable but impossible. That journal entry, discovered decades later, captured the psychological impact of the battle as clearly as casualty figures captured its tactical results. Edson's Ridge had been a revelation, forcing Japanese officers to confront truths their training had not prepared them for. Americans weren't soft. They weren't poorly supplied. They weren't going to break under pressure. They were professional soldiers, well-trained and well-equipped, fighting for objectives they understood with support from an industrial base that was just beginning to demonstrate its full power. The ridge itself still exists, a low spine of land on Guadalcanal that visitors can walk today. Memorials mark where Marines died, defending it, and where Japanese soldiers fell attacking it. The jungle has reclaimed much of the battlefield, but traces remain: shell craters, fragments of equipment, the basic topography that made the position defensible. It looks unremarkable, this small rise in the terrain, until you understand what happened there and what it meant. 840 Marines held that ground against 3,000 attackers and changed the course of a campaign. In doing so, they demonstrated principles that would shape the rest of the Pacific War. The importance of prepared defenses, the decisive power of artillery support, the value of systematic logistics, and the reality that industrial warfare favored the side with greater resources and the will to mobilize them. For Japanese officers like Kokusho, these lessons came at the cost of 1,214 casualties and the shattering of beliefs that had seemed unquestionable. The battle for Edson's Ridge ended on the morning of September 14, 1942, when Japanese forces withdrew into the jungle, their offensive broken. But its impact extended far beyond that morning, shaping perceptions and influencing decisions throughout the remainder of the war. It was a small battle in terms of forces engaged, but its significance was enormous. Proof that American forces could stand against the best Japanese infantry and prevail decisively when backed by superior firepower and logistics. For Major Yukichi Kokusho, Edson's Ridge remained throughout his life the moment when one war ended, another began the war. Japan thought it was fighting, and the war it was actually fighting. The difference between those two wars, revealed in 2 nights of combat on a jungle ridge, would ultimately determine the Pacific War's outcome. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.